Good afternoon, everybody. Here it is, a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon, and I'm inside talking to y'all about American history. So let's get this done so that all of us can have time for something more fun than this. We're talking today about Chapter 5 of your textbook. That's Chapter 5, which deals with the events leading up to the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to try to cover these points pretty quickly, and you need to read your textbook. Don't just rely on this, but here are some general things to understand. First of all, we're going to talk about the colonial empires in North America at about 1700. Now, when we talk about all of these empires, let's recognize that there's a difference between what the different European powers claimed they owned and what in reality they were able to occupy and do something with. But there's a map of this in your textbook. England claimed to own the east coast of what is now the United States, and or part of what is now the United States, not counting what is now Florida, and also claimed to control a big area in northeastern Canada around Hudson Bay. England claimed that was theirs. The French claimed to hold most of the east coast of Canada and the St. Lawrence River, the area around the Great Lakes, all the way down the Mississippi River and part of the and all of the area west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the area west of the Mississippi River that is now North and South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, all of that. The French said that was all theirs. There were a number of Indians who would have disagreed with them, but that's what they said. And Spain claimed, in addition to Mexico, which they were there, claimed to control most of what is now Texas in the southwestern United States and Florida. Now, the reality about that is that in Florida they had a town in St. Augustine, which is still there. It's the oldest town in the United States, oldest European town in the United States, let me say that. And they were there. Here in Texas, at that time in 1700, they really had not been able to establish themselves successfully this far north. They would establish some towns during the years after 1700. There was a town at El Paso, and there were towns in what is now northern New Mexico, Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and a few others. And they were beginning to establish themselves a little bit in California. But they claimed to own all of this, and they were willing to fight each other over it. The boundaries were very unclear. The important thing for you to know about the English colonies that became the first United States is that although geographically that was the smallest of the European claims, it had the most Europeans. There were more people there than there were in the French colonies or in the Spanish Empire. So know that, and know that throughout the early part of the 1700s, and even beginning earlier, there was intermittent war along these boundaries, particularly between the English and the French. There were always little wars breaking out. Now, because the pattern of English settlement was that the settlements were pretty widespread and distributed, and there would be people living out on this little farm here, or maybe a little settlement with 2 or 3 families there, scattered all along the frontier. The French concentrated in bigger settlements for the most part because of different things. And the form of warfare that took place generally consisted of the French stirring up some group of Indians to go and attack different isolated English settlements. And usually this happened because there was a war going on in Europe. And wars broke out in Europe between the English and the French and the Spanish and various Austrians and Germans all the time. And so people in America would get a newspaper and find out, oh, we're at war with the French, or oh, we're at war with the English, and say, well, it's not fair that the people at home get to have all the fun. Let's have a war here too. And they'd go attack each other. And most of those were pretty minor affairs. And most of those didn't make too huge a difference. But beginning in the 1750s, something different came about. And that was that both the English and the French decided they were going to try to establish firmer footholds in America. And England sent soldiers, and the French sent soldiers, and trouble broke out along the boundary, probably in what is now western Pennsylvania, but nobody is sure exactly where. And there was fighting between actual English soldiers and Indians allied with the French, and it spilled over and led to a bigger war in Europe. This is what in American history is referred to as the French and Indian War. In broader world history, it's called the 7 Years' War because it started about 1756 and ended in 1763. And it could be called the First World War because there was fighting in Europe, there was fighting in North America. Most of it took part in New York and in Canada, but there was fighting in North America. There was fighting in some of the islands in the Caribbean Sea, and there was fighting in India. And there were sea battles fought kind of around the world. This was a much bigger war than the ones that had taken place previously, and both countries sent what for the time were pretty good-sized armies to North America. Things went badly for the English at first, but in the end, the English won, and the French were forced to give up nearly all of their claims in North America. And as a result of treaties that went roundabout, it ended up that the English had a recognized claim to all of what became the 13 original states, most of eastern Canada, all of North America up to the Mississippi River, except for Florida, and the French had nothing. They kept 2 little islands off of the east coast of Canada, St. Pierre and Miquelon. French colonists in what is now North Nova Scotia in Canada were forced to resettle. Most of them had long, difficult journeys, first to the Great Lakes and then down the Mississippi River, and settled in what is now Louisiana and became the people that we call Cajuns today, because the French had called that area Acadiana, and the people who lived there Acadians, and it became Cajuns. And Spain had at the time a more or less uncontested claim to everything west of the Mississippi River. Remember that because it's going to be important later. So that takes us up to about 1763. The French and Indian War is over, and we'll talk about what happened after the war. You need to remember that wars are expensive, and wars fought in faraway places are really expensive. And England had spent a lot of money chasing the French out of North America, and they wanted it back. And they decided that they wanted to make their American colonies turn a profit. Now, you remember we talked about how the original colonies were private affairs, really. They were commercial enterprises that private citizens got involved in. I mean, they received a charter from the king and permission to go settle in this place or that, but the British government, the English government, really had very little to say about it and very little part of it. And so these people had, by 1763, people had been in these colonies for a long time, over 100 years, more or less running their own affairs. But the English decided that they needed to, after having spent a lot of money and fought a war, they needed to make these colonies pay. And so they did it by trying to increase their control in the colonies and by imposing taxes. And these are in your book. You need to read them. This lecture is not a substitute for reading your textbook. But you had an English government that was more and more interested in exercising control over the colonies, and colonies that had gotten used to doing whatever they wanted to. And by this time, the colonies, which had previously been entirely separate, had developed some experience in working together toward a common goal, specifically defending themselves from Indians and Frenchmen. So you had a government in England that was becoming more and more assertive against a group of colonies that weren't necessarily welcoming foreign or English control, and they particularly didn't welcome it when two things happened. The first was taxes, and more taxes, and more taxes, and the one that caused the most trouble was the tax on sugar. It was not really possible to produce sugar in the English colonies because, they grew some sugar beets, but sugar beets are not real productive and they're a lot of work, and it's much more practical to get sugar from growing sugar cane. But sugar cane wouldn't grow in those colonies because it was too cold. Uh, and so a very good trade had developed between the British colonies that we think about and the British colonies in the Caribbean, where sugarcane did grow. And the colonists in America imported lots of sugar. Now, it was important for, and lots of molasses as well, which of course is an intermediate product between sugarcane and sugar itself. Um, uh, there was a big trade going on, not just because the colonists all liked candy. Sugar was very important for preserving food, but even more than that, rum or molasses was extremely important because you could use it to make rum. And they did, and the colonists, particularly in New England, imported huge quantities of molasses and made it into rum, which they then either sold in England or in the other American colonies, or they put it on ships and carried it to Africa and traded it for slaves, who they would then take either to the Caribbean or to the southern colonies and sell them for money. And then use the money to buy more molasses, uh, to make more rum to sell in England and Africa. And it was a thriving business. Uh, but the English decided that they were going to put a tax on sugar and molasses because they wanted a cut of the money. Um, uh, and that provoked a lot of resentment. Uh, uh, Particularly in Massachusetts. It provoked a huge resentment. You'll read in your textbook about an episode where a ship belonging to a fellow named John Hancock, who was a rich merchant in Massachusetts, was seized by the government, by the British forces, because it was carrying molasses that had not been taxed, which the people in Massachusetts considered that an outrage. Uh, uh, Fair-minded people who use language correctly would say that Hancock was a smuggler, um, because that's what smuggling is it's carrying goods that haven't been taxed. But created a lot of bad feeling. Um, John Hancock, you will remember, because he wrote he was the first person to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote it in great big letters. Um, um, there developed in Boston a group um, known as the Sons of Liberty, um, who went around stirring up trouble of different kinds about different things. They were organized by a guy named Sam Adams. If you've heard of him, it's most likely because there is now brewed in Boston a pretty expensive brand of beer named after him. But he recruited this group that he called the Sons of Liberty, who were mainly drunks and layabouts who he paid to go throw rocks and snowballs at the British soldiers and break the windows of people who didn't take part in his boycotts. And if you want to know the real truth, the Sons of Liberty were pretty much an equivalent to what we call Antifa today. And they acted and worked in pretty much the same way. But that caused a lot of trouble, and it caused a lot of bad feeling. It eventually led in Boston to to the Boston Massacre, which was not quite as organized an affair as what you hear described. But all of these things were causing a lot of bad feeling. And the taxes were, in particular, in the southern colonies, the sugar tax was upsetting, but they were also upset about taxes being imposed on their tobacco that they grew and sold in England, and taxes on anything they wanted to import, and it was leading to a lot of trouble. And they complained that, well, Parliament imposes these taxes and we don't get to vote in Parliament. That's not fair. So that the slogan came up, taxation without representation is tyranny. And they would say that and put that in things they published and broadsides. And so trouble was developing. We're going to talk in more detail about this on Tuesday and on Thursday, and there's some things that you're going to read that I will have posted for you. But these are the big things, and keep those in mind. Remember the sugar tax and the Intolerable Acts and the Townshend Acts. They're all in your book. Remember them. And we're going to talk some this week about that. Because we're going to be in person, we're going to do some things we haven't done before. So read your textbook and be ready to tell me what's in it, because you'll have to Tuesday or Thursday. Enjoy your weekend. I will see you all in person on Tuesday. Bye.